All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Showtime, that's right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming to October 2017's Science on Tap. Thank you very much for coming. We're gonna I'm really excited for our presentation tonight. I really want to thank everybody for coming. I see some new faces tonight, which is exciting. I really like that. I'm going to give you a 2-second overview of what Science on Tap is all about, and a little bit of housekeeping here. So Science on Tap is essentially a chance for scientists that are working in the Valley to come and talk about their science to non-scientists, to people that are interested in what's going on in Flathead Valley and beyond. And it's really supposed to be laid back. The idea here is that it's relaxed, it's understandable, it's fun. So I think that we have a really great opportunity to learn a lot tonight. And for folks that are new, I want to make 2 points. One is that for every beer that we drink, we get $1 donated to the Flathead Lake Biological Station and the Flathead Lakers. It's funny and it's not funny, so it's true. I think that, so let's raise some funds responsibly. And the other thing is that, like I mentioned, it's a laid-back atmosphere, and so one thing you'll notice is that it may be tricky. You might find yourself throughout the presentation wishing you had a full beer. And what you should do is flag down the waitress that comes through. Usually she comes in right on time. Renee is her name this evening. I usually turn and she's right there, but not tonight. So kindly flag her down. It's acceptable to do the old weird waiter thing. And if you can pantomime or mouth the beer you'd like, that's perfect. And she'll bring it to you. Don't hesitate. Laid back. So the name of the game is everybody's here to enjoy and to understand. So, and if we can raise a little bit of money to keep this program going, all the better. Science on Tap is a co-sponsored event. It's brought to you by the Flathead Lake Biological Station, as well as the Flathead Lakers. And I'm going to give the mic over to my wife Hillary. She's going to talk a little bit about the Flathead Lakers and an important cause coming up.
Thank you. Since there are a few people that are new, I will talk about the Lakers. We are a nonprofit that's been around since 1958, and we've done education, stewardship, and advocacy work all around the lake. And we have a strong community that really believes in making sure that we have protection and different agencies watching out for what's happening in the lake. One thing I would like to mention, that after tonight, if you guys can all go home and email Governor Bullock and voice your support for the Flathead Basin Commission. It's up on the chopping block tomorrow. There's a risk of 90% of their budget being cut. So we really need the Flathead Basin Commission's oversight and how they bring different agencies together and to help protect Flathead Lake. So I encourage you all to become a Flathead Laker member. You can volunteer with us. You can also donate to the Flathead Lake Biological Station. We need to have a strong community so that we can protect this lake for many, many, many generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary. I would reiterate, if you guys can, if you're not a Flathead Lakers member, at this time I usually make people raise their hand that aren't. I'm not going to do that. That's frowned upon. I would argue if you're not, you should be. And if you want to know more, there's plenty of people in the room. Let's do it this way. Are there any Flathead Laker members that would like to talk to non-members about what the Flathead Lakers can do? Anybody with their hand up is an approachable person. If you buy them a beer, they'll talk to you all night. What the Flathead Lakers mean. So come equipped, I guess. That being said, I hope we're all ready for a really great talk tonight. So there's a couple times as an aquatic ecologist that you get really excited for a talk. And I have to say that I'm pretty excited to see what Bob Hall has to say tonight. So Bob is a new faculty hire at the biostation. Just after this guy we walked through. It's a laid-back atmosphere, Matt. He understands. That's what Science on Tap is all about. So I'm really excited that Bob has come to the biostation, because he brings an enormous amount of experience and energy and excitement about ecology in general, but also something that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts, the rivers of Montana. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Bob Hall.
Thanks, everybody. When Sean asked me to do a science on tap, I said, oh, okay, science. Do you want freshwater science or brewing science? And he thought about it. And then before he could answer that, I said, maybe freshwater is better. But at some point, I'll do a talk on brewing science, because that's the other half of me. That's half? Oh, no, it's the other 10%. That was 90%. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about rivers, and I'm going to talk about how carbon cycles through rivers and how food webs interact with that carbon. We'll talk a little bit about how humans affect these processes. A lot of this stuff is going to be sort of a little bit of general stream ecology knowledge. And then some of it will touch on some of the research that I have done, and it's going to be almost all past research. And so we'll combine a little bit of general knowledge, a little bit of research. There will be some data in here. I warned you right away. And so, but I teach for a living, and so it's my job to teach you through this. And so, okay. So for tonight, what are we going to do? We're going to talk about where streams get their carbon to support the food webs, and this will make more sense as we go. We're going to spend half our time talking about this, and the other half saying what happens when humans alter these processes. And so we do a really good job of messing up rivers, and I'm going to show how this might affect the food webs in just a little bit. And so this stream, notice it's a two-part talk. This is a two-part stream. This is a stream in Venezuela that we put a curtain down and fenced out the fish from one side to see how the fish affect carbon cycling processes. Okay, so we're going to just start with a little bit of biology. And how many people were here for Matt's talk last month? Okay, for you guys, this will be a little bit of review. That's a good thing. And so we have a plant here, a potted plant. I have no idea what this is. And this plant is photosynthesizing. When it photosynthesizes, it takes in CO2 and it gives off oxygen. And at the same time, this plant is respiring, where it's giving off CO2 and taking in oxygen. So, are you all photosynthesizing or respiring right now? Respiring, good. And so you're taking in oxygen and giving off CO2. We can measure the CO2 concentration in this room and be really high relative to outside. And this is based on this equation up here. The CO2 plus water yields sugar and oxygen. And so the plant is creating sugar and it's metabolizing these sugars. And so everybody remember this from sophomore biology. Okay, good. We can do the same thing for rivers. So we can think of a river the same way. Now here's where we take a little bit of a stretch. And so we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and in the water, and so it mixes in and dissolves in the water. And then photosynthesis in the river will convert that to organic carbon. You can see some of this organic carbon on the bottom of the river here. This is the Platte River in Wyoming, and right here it's covered with filamentous algae. And so this algae has fixed this carbon, this CO2, and created this biomass, what I'll call organic carbon, on the bottom of the river. And then it's going to respire this carbon at the same time. Now, not only is that algae going to respire the carbon, but also bacteria in the river, and there's lots of those, and all the animals. And in this river, there's lots of those. So we can think of a river the same way we can think of a plant. Okay, so what do we mean by production? And so this is sometimes a tough concept. So go to a lawn and go out and measure how much grass is in your neighbor's lawn. It's one of these giant lawns. It's always short, and you go out and you measure it. And in January, you measure the lawn. There's 1 ton of there's 1 ton of biomass there. You go out in February. There's 1 ton of biomass. You go out in June, September, December. 1 ton. And so that tells you how much standing stock there is. And so you're going to conclude, oh, there's 1 ton of production. There's 1 ton of biomass in here. Now, what do we do to lawns to keep them short? Mow them. And so your neighbor likes to mow a lot, and so in February he removes a half a ton, in April half a ton, half a ton, half a ton. And what we have here is we have extra biomass. We have 2 tons here plus the ton that's sitting in the yard. And so we have a total of 3 tons. And so what's happening is we're harvesting this stuff. And so production is a flow of biomass, okay? It's the creation of biomass. If this yard were dead, what would its production be? 0. And so, but just because the grass is short and you don't see it grow doesn't mean it's not growing. Well, that's what happens in rivers. That's what happens. The algae in the bottom of the river is it turns over very, very quickly. Insects are eating it, and so we don't see the biomass very much. And so we have to be able to measure the production in some way. And we'll spend some time talking about that later. Okay. All right. Soon we'll be over the definitions, and when we do, we can start talking about more interesting things. And so we can go back to this idea of the river as photosynthesizing, and this photosynthesizing, we're going to call it gross primary production, and that's just the word we use for it. I'll call it GPP for short a lot of times. And if we think about this in terms of a business, this is creation of organic matter in the ecosystem, so we'll think of it as revenue in a business. Think of it as revenue. And ecosystem respiration is the breakdown of organic carbon back to CO2 again. And who does this? Algae do it, bacteria do it, and animals do it. You all are doing it right now. And so those are expenses. And then what's left over, if there's more biomass at the end of some period of time than you're starting with at the level of the whole ecosystem, then that's positive net ecosystem production. But we can also have negative net ecosystem production, just like a business, if it's taking out loans, is running on venture capital, is taking a loss. And so we can think of net ecosystem production as the balance between revenue and expenses. But we can do this for an ecosystem. And so for an ecosystem that is positive means that it's got more organic matter at the end of some time period, say a year. In a lake, that might be stored at the bottom of the lake. In a river, that might be stored on the bottom or exported into a floodplain. Okay. So who are these plants? I keep saying algae, algae. You saw some of the filamentous algae on the bottom of the Klamath River. A lot of the algae are these little microscopic guys. Here are some diatoms. Here's some slimy algae on a rock. That's about as scientific as I get talking about these guys. And then here are some other diatoms. These are cool. They form these little stalks, and they sit on top of these stalks. This stuff is good bug food, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But just want to give you just a sense of the natural history. But these are the plants we're talking about. Now, they're not plants at all, but they're photosynthesizing single-celled organisms. Okay, so now we want to go measure this in a stream. And so I mentioned before that we can't go out and measure the accrual of biomass very easily, because these little algae, they grow at a rate of their biomass turns over every 2 days. So every 2 days they divide and create a daughter cell. So they're growing very, very fast, faster than your lawn grows. And then they're getting eaten or sloughed away by the current. And so we don't see much of a change in the biomass, but we know that there's some production. And so what we do is we take advantage of this equation right here, this chemical equation. Remember, CO2 plus water yields H2O, which we call that sugar, plus oxygen. And then respiration goes the other direction. And so it's easy to measure oxygen in fresh water. It's a little harder to measure CO2, but it's easy to measure oxygen. And so if we measure the oxygen concentration and how that changes through time, then maybe we can understand what the rate of production is in the river. And so and we measure this through time. And this little guy right here is about the size of my beer glass. And it's $1,000, and that little instrument has changed my life. Because they used to be where you would collect these things back in the day. You'd stay up all night and you'd collect samples and you'd measure the oxygen. And that's not much fun. Or you can buy these big instruments which cost $20,000 and then they get stolen, and that's not much fun. But these, on the other hand, we can hide them in streams and we can put these things everywhere and measure oxygen with them, and they're very inexpensive. And so that little guy right there, all it does is sit and measure oxygen concentrations. And that's one of my study streams in the Rocky Mountain National Park. The other thing is that oxygen is exchanging with the atmosphere, and so we'll ignore that. But I do know that that happens, and I know how to deal with it. But we don't need to talk about it. I mean, you'd be amazed at what people will say about grand proposals about that. That term right there between the atmosphere and the water is a field unto itself, and you do not want me going there. Okay, so here's then some of the data. And so here's time, and so this is midnight, noon, midnight, and there's dissolved oxygen concentrations. And it's low at nighttime, and then it goes up during the day. Why is it going up during the day? The sun's out, and what's happening? Photosynthesis. And then it goes up, it peaks just after noon, and then it declines and goes back down to the bottom again. And so if we know this, what we can do is we can fit a mathematical model to it. And so here's the map, all written in English. And so if we take this change in dissolved oxygen with the change in time, so how fast is it changing? It's equal to the production plus the respiration, which is a negative number, plus this air-water gas exchange, which I promised not to talk about. And it's these three things that are controlling the shape of that curve. And so we're able to fit a model to this and calculate what the primary production and ecosystem respiration are for one day. And so here it is for one day, and it's 2 grams of oxygen and minus 2.7. And so in this case, there's more oxygen being consumed than being produced, and so the respiration is higher than the photosynthesis. This technique was worked out 61 years ago by a guy named Howard Odom, who was a major professor of Charlie Hall here, sitting in the front seat. And so this is an old technique. It's gotten newer because of those little sensors. I should say it's gotten new. We use it a lot more now because of these sensors and because of some because we've worked out ways of doing the calculations that make it much easier. But this is it. This is how we do it. And we're essentially watching the stream breathe here. It's releasing oxygen during the day and consuming it at nighttime. And so now we have this tool to be able to go and measure this in a lot of places. Okay, so we have measured this in a lot of places. And so here's some data. I collected some of these data. Other people collected these data, where they went out and they measured it for one day, just like I did in Spring Creek. And they measure this over one day. And then they calculate the primary productivity, which I've plotted down here, and they plotted the respiration. And here I've got the respiration as a positive value, not negative. And so most of the points show that there's a lot more respiration going on than there is production. And so this line right here is where production and respiration are equal. That's where they're balanced. If they're this side of the line, the production is greater than the respiration, and we'll call that stream autotrophic. I'll define that term in a second. And if they're on the other side of that line, then the stream is heterotrophic and respiration is bigger than production. And so here we go, more words. Heterotrophic means other, troph means to feed, and hetero means other. It means other feeding. And typically we use this to describe organisms, like you all are heterotrophs. You don't make your own food, you eat other stuff. A plant is an autotroph because it makes its own food. Auto means self-feeder. And again, we treat these ecosystems with these organismal analogies, and we say, okay, this is an ecosystem way up there that's being fed by something else, and this one right here is being fed by itself. And so that means it's being fed by something else. And so what might that something else be? Where is these things getting its carbon from? So this would be like a business that is bleeding money. And so if it's bleeding money, it means it's got to be getting it from somewhere else. So let's take a look at where that might be. And one of the more famous quotes in river ecology is this one up here. In every respect, the valley rules the stream, named after a guy named Noel Hines. And what Hines showed, and he just synthesized a bunch of information, is that what goes on in here is a function of what goes on out here. So what do you guys see around this little dinky stream in New Hampshire? You see the trees, and it has leaves, and the leaves fall in the stream. That is where the stream is getting its energy from. It's getting its energy, it's getting its organic carbon from its watershed. It's coming from outside the stream into it. And this stream right here is the stream where this idea was worked out in the early 70s. And so this is a
Which stream is that?
That's a tributary of Bear Brook and Hubbard Brook, New Hampshire. And so this is a famous and so this is the site where people work this, where this guy Stuart Fisher worked this out, and you can see where they got this idea from. It's like, where is this thing getting its carbon from? But it's not just tiny forest streams; it's big rivers. What's around this big river? This is the Yukon River. Pardon? Yeah, lots of the floodplain, and this river is meandering around this floodplain, gathering up this carbon over long time scales. And so that's getting into the river too. Here, much closer to home, this is the Swan River. There's trees in this river, and so there's tremendous amounts of interaction with the watershed by trees falling into the Swan River, and that represents an organic matter source to this river. Here's a good one. There's a novel subsidy, if you will, from the watershed. And so these are wildebeest in the Mara River in Kenya. So this is a picture I just took a month ago. And this wasn't a crossing. They were there just to drink. But if it were a crossing, you'd see all those guys going in, and a bunch of them would die. And when they do die, you get this. And so this is a pile of carcasses right here that represent a subsidy to this river. And I have some colleagues who are working there, and they calculate how much wildebeest carbon goes in and who eats it. And it's disgusting research. Okay, so what happens to this organic matter when it gets into the stream? Who eats this stuff? And so I'll just give you some examples, some of the bugs here. So these are things that might eat algae in western rivers. There's a mayfly up there, and here is a midge larvae. If you fish for trout, you know exactly what these things are. These are perfect trout food. And that one right there scrapes algae off the surface of the rocks. And this guy will collect algae either off the surface of the rocks or organic matter just comes up on the bottom of the river. But some of these bugs eat leaves, and so this one right here is a leaf-eating specialist from the East Coast. It's one of my favorite bugs. And this is a stonefly larva, and the top is a caddisfly larva that also eats leaves, and we'll call those shredders, and that is in fact what we call them. We call them shredders. They tear apart leaves, and they stick them in their stomachs, and they're able to eat this stuff. And so the leaves that fall into the stream, and sometimes even the wood that falls into the streams, these guys are able to eat. And all this stuff then becomes food for the predators right here, and so that's the predator of these bugs. And that's the predator of the trout. Although I do know that he threw that back since I was taking the picture and it was my boat. So there is the simple food web, if you will, and it can be based off these different sources of organic matter. Okay, so here then is a caricature of a stream food web. And here's one, I like this picture because it explicitly links the stream food web to its valley and shows that the stream is just part of a larger habitat that surrounds the stream. And so here we'll have the organisms in streams that we know very well. There's trout. There are insects right there that the trout eats for food. These insects will eat leaves and algae. I just showed you a couple of those things. Where do the leaves come? The leaves come from the riparian zone outside the stream and fall in. The trout, if anybody fishes for trout in here, knows that they love terrestrial insects, things like grasshoppers, ants, beetles. And so those things fall in. And when a beetle falls in that is made from a tree, because that's what it's eating, the trout is going to eat it, and now that trout is made from that tree. If the trout eats the insect that eats leaves, that trout is made from the leaves. And so that trout is connected to the watershed in a strong, strong way, energetically. I think what happens is that this stuff can then leave the stream, and so the bugs will fly out, and there'll be food for swallows and bats and things like that. Anyone who's been to a river has seen swallows flying up and down, eating the bugs. Well, the swallows are being made out of river algae, or they're being made out of the trees around, depending on where they're getting it. Spiders eat spiders will eat emerging insects too. So we have this food web that extends beyond the stream, comes from outside the stream, and it goes back to outside the stream. Now, how do we measure these pathways? This is just a drawing right here. And so what I'm interested in knowing is like, okay, well, it's fine to say, yeah, we think this leaves. How do we measure these things right here? And this is where it just becomes hard work. And so what we do is we look in the stomachs of the bugs. And you take a bug, and these things are tiny, they're about 1 centimeter long, and you cut out the stomach, and then you put the food underneath the microscope, and you count and measure the size of the particles. And so there's a diatom, there's algae material, there's the claw of some animal, the mandible of some animal. Here's more diatoms, fungi, filamentous algae, and at the top are leaf detritus. And so you can see leaf detritus, and so you look through and you see what these things are eating. It's super tedious, but it's very, very effective. There's other ways of doing it. If anybody who's taken an ecology class using stable isotopes, and that's very, very effective too, but that's not something I want to spend the next hour talking about. But there are other ways of doing this too, by looking at essentially the nuclear structure of the carbon that an animal is made up from to figure out where it's getting its carbon from. That's another day.
You're here.
Yeah. Sean does that work, ask him.
It'll take more than an hour.
Okay, what do we do about fish? And so the fish, we just look in their stomachs too. And so this is my colleagues Emma and Holden holding a humpback chub, and they're pushing water through one end of the trout so the food comes out the other. And this is of the chub. And this, by the way, is totally harmless. These fish are an endangered species. We do this work, and they go back in. Every one has a tag on it, and they live for years after we do this. So this is harmless for the fish. It's not harmless for the insects, it turns out. You can't pull their stomach out. And then, when we're done, we look in and there. And so, what's this fish eating? Algae, yeah. So that's what we do. And there's other things, there's bugs in there you can't see, we count those. But yes, the algae. This is from the Grand Canyon. Occasionally you find pork chops in there. I'm not making that up. Okay. All right. So there's some of the basic biology of what we do. Now let's try to apply it with some knowledge of how streams work. And so I'm going to give some examples here. And so this human impact was caused by researchers. And what they did, and this is from my dissertation research in Georgia, 20-some years ago now, where my advisors disconnected a stream from its valley. And so before I said the stream is very linked to its valley, and so they got the bright idea, let's disconnect it and see what happens. And they did this by taking this small stream, and on top is a gill net, a fishing net, and they covered the whole stream with a net, not just part of the stream, the whole stream. So from below where I was standing to 200 meters upstream where the stream came out of the ground. And so the whole stream was covered with a net. No leaves can get in. Then they built a fence on the side of the stream to keep the stuff from falling down the hill from getting in. And so no more leaves got to fall in the stream. And then they did this, and then they realized, wow, we did this work, and all of a sudden they noticed for the first time all this wood at the bottom of the stream that was normally covered by leaves, and they thought, well, that's not good. And so they went and got rid of all the wood and replaced it with PVC pipes to mimic the structure of the wood. And so essentially they just sort of cut the stream off at the knees by preventing any organic matter from coming in. And so what do you think happened to the insects that lived in this stream? Yeah. And so,
more nutritious.
Huh?
They got more nutritious.
Yeah. What happened was that their secondary production declined, and so here's this was the pre-treatment year, and then years 2, 3, and 4 are the years that they did the experiment. The experiment actually went on for another 20 years, but I'm just going to show the first few here.
Where is this?
This is Coweta in North Carolina. And on the top, where the open squares are, that's a reference. And so that's a stream that you don't mess with and just look at through time. And then the bottom is a stream that they did mess with. And so you see there's a difference between the reference and the treatment stream, just because production in these streams is going to be different for a whole host of reasons besides the treatment. But which direction is the reference stream going over time? And which stream is this one? Which way is this going? Yeah, and by a few years later, this was almost zero. And so what this shows is it shows that the animals in this stream are essentially supported by the leaf litter that comes out. You get rid of that leaf litter, and the animal production, that is the creation of animal biomass, goes away. Question in the back.
How close together were those two streams?
About a mile. Yeah. So they're receiving more or less the same climate, and they're the same size, and they're not the same stream. One's not a mimic of the other, which is why we call it a reference. But they're close enough that any climatic influences will be the same between both of them, like weather. Okay. So we've done this experiment at a much larger scale. And so this is the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon, which we very effectively disconnected from its watershed by building Glen Canyon Dam. And so this is a place that I've worked in for years. And what happened is we build a dam, and all the stuff that gets transported from upstream settles behind the dam, so that you essentially have clear water coming out from the dam. And we studied two parts, right up, which I'll call the Glen Canyon, and then towards the bottom, which is in Grand Canyon. In particular, most of the data I'm going to show today from Diamond Creek, but really Grand Canyon is all this part right here. And let's go through, and so just get the animations here. Let me go through and explain what's happening. So in Glen Canyon Dam, water comes out and it's brilliantly clear. And so here's a picture of it. This is the horseshoe bend, and you can see that the river is green, and it's green because it's clear and it's got lots of algae in the bottom. It's very, very productive habitat, extremely productive. And it's full of these guys right here. How many people have fished below Glen Canyon Dam? Anybody? And?
There's a lot of fish until you get past the Little Colorado.
Yeah. Exactly.
A lot of rainbows.
A lot of rainbows. And so it's mostly rainbow trout up here. Go way downstream, and the fish assemblage picks up a lot of the remaining 4 native species: speckled dace, bluehead sucker, flannel mouse sucker, and the endangered humpback chub. And then it picks up a lot more exotic species and non-native species that we won't talk about. And so here, it's essentially one species, rainbow trout, and then down here, this broader assemblage. Clear water, and then this is what it looks like down below. It's very, very cloudy. And it's cloudy because we have tributary inputs. The Paria River, the Little Colorado River, Knab Creek, Havasu Creek. These all come in and they bring with it turbidity. So we have this river that forms a sort of gradient of very clear water and very cloudy as you go downstream, because the tributaries are bringing in sediment. And they're bringing in sediment that is both inorganic, so sand and clay, and organic sediment, stuff that bugs eat. And so what we did is we made a budget for this stuff. And we said, okay, how much organic matter is coming in? And we measured primary production both close to the dam and very far from the dam. And that's the green bar right there. And so the primary production is much higher close to the dam than it is far away. Why do you guys think it's higher close to the dam? Water is clear. So clear water close to the dam allows light to go through and allows for a lot of photosynthesis. And so clear water near the dam, lots of production, not much downstream. But remember I said that this watershed, close to the dam, we've disconnected this from the watershed, so there's no terrestrial organic matter, next to no terrestrial organic matter coming in, because it's not connected to the upstream. But downstream, it is connected a little bit because the tributaries come in. It turns out the tributaries bring in monstrous amounts of carbon. Like these rivers flood and they turn to mud, and all this comes in with lots and lots of organic matter. So it's sort of a tale of two organic matter budgets here. Lots of algae, not much terrestrial leaf detritus, lots of terrestrial detritus, not much algae. Now, what do the food webs do? Okay, so on this axis down here, we have the watershed area, where we think of the watershed as essentially starting right near the dam. Because remember, it's disconnected, and so it's very close, it's very small, And it gets bigger as you go downstream. Up is the distance downstream, so if you were to float the river, how far is that? So these are the same data, just plotted in a slightly different way. And Talk about sensory evaluation for you. No signal. Take a look.
The first time went out, so let's see. What are we missing, Bob?
Change the shape of slides. Let's go with it.
You all right?
Yeah, let's not have it. Change the shape of these slides, but let's just live with it. Okay. So what this axis is over here is how much of the fish are made by terrestrial material. And so we can pick up a fish, and based on you look at the fish's diet, and then you look at the diet of what the fish ate, and we can calculate what fraction of that fish came from terrestrial material, leaves, wood, things like that came from the watershed, came from the valley, versus algae. And so we do this, and so we find up to 40% downstream of the fish are made out of terrestrial material, which means that the other 60% is made from algae in the river. So despite receiving all this terrestrial material, algae still provide the fuel for the food web down here. Now, with some data I'm not going to show you, we suggested that what the detritus does is it makes these food webs more stable, and so less likely to be perturbed by disturbance. And so that's an interesting idea. And so what we find is more stable, more diverse food webs downstream, where they have access to some detritus and terrestrial inputs relative to just the trout-based food web up close to the dam, where they're based solely on algae. So there's an example of what we can do to a food web in a river. Okay. So here's a river. Now we're going to talk about the effects of nutrients. And so these are two streams. These are in Montana. And so these are two streams that a Montana State employee, Mike Sukley, took pictures of to try to ask the question I'll ask you guys. Which river would you rather recreate in? Which one? I'm going to use the word recreate. I'll tell you why in just a second. Which one? Which side? Right or left? Right. Okay, right. And that's what's the answer.
Well, it depends if I want fishing.
And so my wife Annette took some of these photos and showed them to folks in Utah and asked them that same question so they could value water quality. And so this is how they value water quality, is by asking, yeah, well, it's recreational use, and how they which would you rather be in? Because the one that you'd rather be in is the one you're spending money on. So what causes this over here? And so what's going to cause that is nutrients coming into the river, okay? And so nitrogen and phosphorus. And so last week we talked about, Matt talked a little bit about this. And what these are is essentially provides other elements that algae need to build themselves. So nitrogen in their proteins, phosphorus in ribosomes and their nucleic acids. And so they need both these things. You need both of these things. And there can be too much of a good thing. And so what we're doing is we're taking long time series of river metabolism. By long, I mean up to 20 years, and trying to ask the question, can we use these long time series of river metabolism to assess what happens when humans fertilize the food web to some great extent with nutrients? And two things have enabled this discovery. Two things. And so there's a one over there. One is that management agencies have been collecting these data for years. They buy these sensors and they put them out and they maintain them because we use oxygen for water quality. We manage river water bodies for water quality, of which maintaining oxygen concentrations is an important thing. And so they're not interested in maintaining or calculating metabolism. They just collect these data. They collect these data, they stick them on servers, they put them on the cloud, and there they lie. They're free for anybody to take, including you and me. And then fast computers came along, and computational statistics, which allow us to be able to take 20 years worth of data where the oxygen is collected at 10-minute time intervals. So I can't do that math in my head. 10 minutes. Every 10 minutes, how many times? That's 144 times a day, 365 days a year, 20 years. You see and hundreds of streams, you see the computational tricks. And so this, sadly, is how I've spent a bunch of my life in the past 3 years, is figuring out the computational statistics part. And then happily, I won't talk about it right now. But if you all read the 538 blog, we use the same stats that Nate Silver does. Oh, I should point out, that's what 20 years worth of metabolism data look like. And a colleague of mine in Spain, who's going to be a postdoctoral associate at the station, she did that just 2 days ago. And so here's one of these rivers in Spain. And so here's a river in the Basque Country, and this river is polluted with nutrients, and it's got a lot of algae in it. Here are two students. That's filamentous algae. And so that's what this river looks like. And this river, they've been monitoring the oxygen concentrations for 20 years, and so there's some data. And so let's take a look at these data. And the top of that says what happens to production and respiration when you add a sewage treatment plant. And so let's take a look here. So on this axis right here is primary production. And so primary production is getting bigger as we go this way for each of these panels. On the y-axis, the up and down axis, is respiration. And so respiration is getting bigger as we go more negative. And high rates of respiration, remember, respiration consumes oxygen in a river. And so when respiration is really high at night, there will be high oxygen consumption. There will be high oxygen consumption. So this is a river that's polluted. And so the black points are before they put in the sewage treatment plant, and the blue points are after they put the sewage treatment plant in. So what happened to production after the sewage treatment plant? It decreased. What happened to respiration? It decreased. So from the river's perspective, was the sewage treatment plant a success? Yeah, I think so. I think so. And so this is a particularly amazing data set, and it's because the Basque government took the time to collect these data long before they started doing this work.
I don't believe that data.
You don't believe it?
No, because you add, from the sewage treatment plant, you're adding phosphorus and nitrogen, and you're going to increase the algae, the plants.
Well, before there was untreated sewage.
Oh.
Yeah.
Make that clear.
Yeah, okay, I'll make that clear. Before it was untreated sewage. Now it's treated sewage. Yeah. Thanks.
Reducing the nutrients in the flow?
Yes. Okay, and so here's Here's another river. This is the Klamath River, and this is in Northern California. And this is some research that I have done over the past few years. And so let's take a look at the Klamath River. And so that's my former student Laurel kayaking to do her master's thesis in this river. This river is bright green. Why is it bright green? So this river lies downstream, so this is California, upstream is Oregon, and upstream there's an area of extensive agriculture. And then this river, the river goes through a lake, the Upper Klamath Lake, and then it goes through a series of dams. The bottom four there, Iron Gate, two Copco dams, and Boyle. And so it goes through these dams, and there behind the dams has very nutrient-rich water, algae grow, and then this water gets released and turns the river green. The nutrients come out all the time and really drive high primary production in the river, as we'll see in just a second. And so downstream is land that is the traditional homes of the Karuk and the Yurok tribes, and these guys have been monitoring oxygen concentration in this river for many, many years. And again, they've been monitoring this because they're very interested in water quality. There's salmon that come in. The temperatures can get really high in the summer. Oxygen can go down, and so they've been watching this for a long time. And so they have all this oxygen data they've been collecting at these 3 sites, which I've color-coded here. Now, because this river upstream is where this is what somebody has called an upside-down river. So upstream is where all the agriculture is. Downstream is beautiful. It's this lovely canyon. There's not much going on in the watersheds. Some logging. Not many people live there. And so the river is sort of backwards, and the downstream section is relatively untouched by humans, and the upstream section is full of agriculture. And so on this axis, what here is I have these different sites, the green site corresponding to those colors over there, and you can plot it against its proportion of its discharge that it gets from Iron Gate Dam. So close to the dam, 100% of the discharge comes from the dam. But as you go downstream, it gets diluted by that river, that river, that river, that river. So we have all this dilution, and the river is bringing really low nutrient water. And so the water quality improves as you go downstream just through dilution. And so this is nice from a science perspective. It's nice from a river perspective, because the river gets a little less manky as you go downstream. But it's also nice from a science perspective, and now we have different nutrient concentrations. And so this is total nitrogen right here. That's one nutrient. Declines as you go downstream. And then we have we have soluble phosphorus up at the top, and that declines as you go downstream. Now those units on there don't mean much to you, 0.15 milligrams per liter. I'm just going to tell you right now that's a lot. Okay, so then we took the oxygen data and we used it to calculate metabolism. So this is 9 years of metabolism data for this river collected for these 3 sites. And so on the top is production, on the bottom is respiration. So there's a few things to notice about this. So for each one of these, the respiration more or less matches the production. And so these are sort of in balance. And so this is a river where the production and the respiration are mostly in balance. This is another river that's kind of disconnected from its watershed in the summertime. And the key here is the summer. So almost all the respiration is coming from the production. So there's not much terrestrial organic matter. So this is a story about algae, not terrestrial organic matter. You can also see that the production declines as you go downstream. It's higher in the green, in the middle, the blue is a little bit lower, and then it goes down. And then you see within each year there's this pattern of it getting low and getting high and getting low again. And that corresponds to light inputs. Now you may be wondering, well, why is there a big gap every year in the winter time? And this is because the Klamath River gets smoked by big rain on snow events in the winter. And this river will go from being this nice river to 300,000 cubic feet per second, and any sensors left in the river are now headed to the ocean. And so they pull these things in the wintertime to save money. And so we don't have data in the winter, but you could pretty much guess that it's the production, and because it's low when we start and low in the end, it's probably low through the winter time too. This river really, really rages, and that's from the tributary inputs. It's not coming from the dam. So there's the metabolism. And so let's take a look then when we summarize these data. So each point there is one summer from one site. So each point is really like 90 days worth of data. And so each point is 90 days worth of data. Here I've plotted against nitrogen and phosphorus. And on this axis, cut off thanks to the computer glitch, is primary production, gross primary production, or photosynthesis. I'm not going to worry about respiration here because respiration is the mirror image of photosynthesis. And what we see is we see this increase in production as we get closer to the dam, and we see this increase as we get closer to the dam and with more phosphorus and with more nitrogen. We see this increase in the nitrogen and the phosphorus. You may be wondering what's going on with these two sites right here, and I'm wondering the same thing. That was the year of the big drought. That was the California drought of 2014 and 2015. And so something's happening in this river that we're not able to predict. So we threw a ton of modeling effort at this, some statistical modeling on top, and we're still left with no answers. And so, which
per square meter or per cubic meter?
It's per square meter. And so we're at a loss for that. But that's what makes science fun. If I had all the answers, I wouldn't be here. So we see this nice increase, and so this suggests that nutrients was driving these very high rates of primary productivity in this river. I'll point out for just a second is that if you've ever been to a lake talk, and there's probably been several of them around here, and we have lake experts in the room, that this is something that lake folks have known for a long time. You add nutrients to a lake, and it's going to turn green, and this is not a shocking revelation to people who work in lakes. In streams, it's a bit of a shocking revelation. And it's not until we've had these data we've been able to sort of show this, and it's because other things control metabolism in rivers, like floods and low light conditions and murky water from sediments and things like that. And but this is evidence that, nutrients matter too in some places. Okay. So I'm going to leave you with 3 thoughts tonight. I'll read them to you since most of them are missing. Food webs and streams and rivers are intimately tied to their valleys. And they're tied to the valleys because the valley is a source of carbon, and it might also be it's also a source of nitrogen and phosphorus to grow algae. So stuff you do outside the river is going to affect what goes on inside. Terrestrial inputs support animal production as well as riverine algae. So if you take a fish from a stream, even around here, some fraction of that fish is made from the trees in the watershed, and some is made from the algae in the stream. Especially if they're eating a lot of terrestrial insects. And external inputs of nutrients is what supports in-stream production, but too much of a good thing is not so good. And so this is a similar story we've seen for lakes. And I'll show you the real reason I do this research. It's because I get to spend a lot of time in boats. And so here's my colleague, Mike Yard. This is getting through lava falls in Glen Canyon. And so he's a postdoc, he's a researcher on the project, but he also knows how to run a powerboat. Yeah, don't try this at home right there. What's the flow right then? That's going to be median. That's summer flows. That's around 14,000 cubic feet per second. And then here's what it looks like in the winter when we take one of our big boats through. Same rapid. That's a day when when we came out of the water, everything turned to glazed ice. It was like a giant icicle. And then here are the boats they let me run. All right, I'll take questions.
That was really great, Bob. I mean, that was spectacular. We'll give Bob a chance to knock this beer down, and I think that I'm really impressed. That was really accessible. That was the name of the game of Science on Tap. That was the epitome of it right there. I was worried at all the figures, all the data. I'm not at all now. That was really well done. That was really great.
I worry about my data.
Yeah, that's not how I meant it. All right, so I think it's about 7 o'clock now-ish, roughly. So we'll have about a half an hour of questions, if that works for everybody. I'm going to let Bob handle it. He seems to have a good grasp of how to work a crowd here. So I would argue if you have your question, speak up. Bob will repeat it, or we'll pass the mic around, whichever sort of happens organically. And let's hear it for Bob again. Wonderful job.
Can you talk a little bit about the influence of the wildfires this year on watershed?
Such a really well-studied topic with small streams, less so big rivers. And in general, streams recover pretty quick from disturbances. And so one thing they found out is that the food base of the river does change. And one of the reasons why, but the bugs don't seem to care because the bugs are pretty flexible with what they eat. And so you might imagine that after a fire, algae become more dominant in the food web than leaf litter. Most of the bugs are like, no worries, we'll switch to algae. And so, so they're pretty resilient when it comes to that. Now, what does take a long time to recover is if these streams landslide. And if it changes the shape or the sediments in the river, then that is a long recovery period. But if you just change the food, it's not a big deal. And there's oftentimes a short nutrient pulse that comes in right after fires, and that will affect that'll grow a little bit more algae. But based on work that a colleague of mine at Idaho State has done since the Yellowstone fires, the streams have recovered pretty well. So as for these fires, that remains to be seen, but in general, it's not the end of the world for small streams from fire.
Can you talk with regards to changes in aquatic temperature with regards to food web and how that goes in time?
Yeah, so what happens when streams warm up? And a colleague who we're working with right now to write a proposal, Jim, who's here occasionally. Well, no, he's a professor. No, not you, Jim. Other Jim, Jim Hood. And so what Jim Hood has done is that he works in Iceland where they have streams that have all the same water but different temperatures. And it's because the ground is hot over here and cold over here. And so they've got this beautiful study system. Because normally you can't go to Yellowstone and do this work because if a hot stream in Yellowstone is full of all these weird chemicals. And so it's not a good comparison. And so, but there they can do it. And what they find is that it's not as easy to predict as what you might think. And so there they warmed up the stream, and then they said, okay, well what's going to happen after we warm up the stream? And what happened is a bunch of new bugs moved in, and they're kind of big. And afterwards they scratched their head and said, oh, that's interesting, we wouldn't have predicted that. And so it's pretty idiosyncratic as the response. And so I know this is probably not what you wanted to hear, but the response is we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We have theory to predict what happens, and then what happens is reality steps all over the theory. Pardon? Well, I mean, we need to have these predictions before we go. And so, oh, she said it's all ivory tower. I said, we need to have these predictions and understand how they go. And so we do have some predictions with metabolism, and we do see these increases in metabolism with temperature. And so they will go a little bit faster, but other things usually step in and alter it a lot.
So from like global warming things or whatever, where everything is increasing in temperature, that's not really affecting the food web in the stream?
It will. And so from the metabolism and insect part, it's idiosyncratic because some things that are cold will go away and some things that are warm will move in. And so that does happen with fish. That does happen. And so the warming is very bad for trout. Yeah, and so that will happen, and that is a pretty strong expectation. What happens at the bottom of the food web we know less about, like what I've been talking about today. I think that probably is a better answer to what you want to know. Right.
Can you give me an example of where the research that you're doing is going to be a change in the way water is managed?
So in the Grand Canyon, they specifically hired us to help change the way they manage the Grand Canyon. And so the Grand Canyon is managed under adaptive management, and where they take all the best science and they take everybody else's opinion on how to run the river and do it.
I'm going to ask you what the best science is, whether it's with the fish, with the fish, with the algae, you know, the holistic view for ecology.
Okay, so it's both, and so one of the findings we had in the Grand Canyon I didn't talk about here is that when they did one of the experimental floods that they talk about, what that did is that stimulated fish production. And the reason why it stimulated fish production is it stimulated the production of their favorite foods. And so we were able to measure that, the insects, and we were able to link that together. And so now what happens is they don't want to stimulate trout production. They don't do them in the springtime. And so they changed when they do these floods based on our research. And so that's one application. Some days, yes, yeah. And at some point, what I'd like to do with this metabolism is to work this up into a way to be able to allow managers to be able to calculate metabolism and use this as a tool to assess the condition of rivers. At the moment, this metabolism stuff I'm doing with all these computer models and all these sites is still in the realm of research, but we're writing computer code and we're putting that computer code online so anybody can use it, so that anyone can do this stuff. So tomorrow you can download the models that I use to do all this stuff and calculate it yourself. Yeah.
Could you give us examples of how invasive species have changed in metabolism or in their productivity?
Yeah, so certain invasive species can really change stream productivity. So zebra mussels in the Hudson River completely change productivity by grazing the algae down. So the productivity of floating algae in that river is much, much lower. Mud snails in and around streams in Yellowstone, museum of mud snails, which are these dinky snails, and this is something I've studied. They usurp most of the productivity of these rivers, and so they don't so much change the nitrogen cycle as become the nitrogen cycle. And so the largest fluxes of carbon and nitrogen in this river get routed through the snails because there's so many of them in the river. So when exotic animals can become dominant, they will change nutrient cycling. Yellowstone Lake, we've seen changes in nutrient cycling or model changes in nutrient cycling in the streams because Yellowstone Lake used to have these big migrations of Yellowstone cutthroat trout into the small streams. Those migrations have been taken down to nearly zero, and so what happened is that those trout used to bring up a lot of nitrogen into these streams. And these are streams that don't have a lot of nitrogen to begin with, and so we calculated that they bring up a lot less nutrients now that they've been mostly extirpated by lake trout. So yeah, invasive species can have a big effect.
Are you able to include in your modeling the effect of bacteria and bacterial phages on the carbon cycling?
So in these models, we have bacteria. They're just in there consuming. Most of them are going to be consuming oxygen and respiring, and so they're just in there implicitly. And so what we have not done is sort of put a lot of interesting microbiology into the models, like what Matt does for research. And so we've not done that yet, and that represents a pretty significant research frontier to try to do. But yes, there's thousands of species of bacteria all doing different things, and what I'm doing here is I'm just lumping all of their behavior into just this one thing called respiration and production. And I do that on purpose, recognizing that I'm working at this much higher level and ignoring what's going on at a lower level. Not that what's not going on down there is terrifically interesting, but that just represents something that I'm not smart enough to
do. When you showed the sort of asymptotic relation of increasing heterotrophy on fish production, and you said that fish always get roughly half of their food from algae. Were you doing this with isotopes or stable isotopes, or how were you getting there? How were you determining that the fish were getting their food from an algae-based food chain?
We were looking at gut contents of the fish, and so we're seeing what they're eating. And then we look at the gut contents of the things that they eat. And then getting models that Bob Ulanovich worked out in the mid-70s. Yeah. He uses matrix math for that. That's off topic.
The fact that the University of Montana is having budget issues is pretty well known in this region. Can you tell me what you did to biosafety at this time, what the excitement is that attracted you at a time when we hear a lot about problems with the university?
Hold on now. I know you can answer it. That is a exit ramp off of river metabolism that I didn't see coming. I guess, you know, Hillary, I get your vote on this. We'll allow it. Moderators will allow it, but geez Louise, can I ask a question after this? I mean, goodness.
I want to hear Bob's answer.
We're going to hear Bob's answer, Tom. Jeepers. Come on, man. Yeah, he signed the paperwork. It's here, so have at it, Bob.
Well, I came from a university, which I loved, Wyoming, which also has budget issues, so I'm aware of what it's like to be operating under university budget issues, and that's not why I left Wyoming, and the budget issues are not why I came here. And so the reason why I came here is the opportunity to work at a field station where the field work and the research and the teaching all happen in the same place, working in the same university.
Probably the opportunity to work with Jim also.
Thank you, listener. The whole field station.
I would think that it's to work with me. Come on.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sean.
I'll see myself.
Try to get us back on track.
Thank you, sir.
You know, carbon is really important in the metabolism of water. And isn't there a lot of carbon that comes from the smoke from forest fires?
You know, so it's probably not going to be an important component of the budget for a river. A river that's in a stream that's in a burned forest will get a lot of the burned organic matter coming in, otherwise known as charcoal. And that people have done this experiment. They've fed charcoal to bugs, and they really don't grow well on it. And then what comes in from the smoke is not going to make that much of a difference, I think, to a river. Now, to the lake, it could be a significant difference because of the nutrients that are in that smoke, like nitrogen and phosphorus. But to a river, probably not. And it's because the river is getting so much carbon from getting terrestrial vegetation, groundwater coming in. The smoke is probably just going to be a tiny component of that. And of that carbon, it's not going to be very tasty as far as the bug is concerned.
Not reduced, it's oxidized. And not an energy source.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine eating Kingsford charcoal.
It's going to be tough. So to further explore your analogy of a business and revenues and costs, we all know that businesses have sunk costs. And so is there something equivalent in ecology of a sunk cost for business?
Second law of thermodynamics.
So, explain to the audience and your non-economist husband what a sunk cost is.
So a sunk cost, an example would be brick and mortar. You build something to which you run your business in, and that's a sunk cost. Or you buy machinery to make the widgets that you're making. Those are all sunk costs, and they're depreciated over time, that kind of thing.
Logs.
Yeah, maybe we could think of long-term storage of organic matter in an ecosystem as one of those things. Somebody say logs. Pardon? Enzymes? Yeah, but those turnovers so. I'm thinking of something that lasts a long time. I think that's probably taking the analogy too far. That's what I think. I mean, not that I appreciate your creativity, but I just think it might be a step too far for me right now.
Okay, I'll try and get us back to the topic again. A long time ago, at the very beginning of your talk, you spoke about sugar. And I remember sugar as being something like C12, H22O11, and your chemical composition is different. Is there different sugars that I'm not aware of?
That's just a cheap and easy shortcut for writing sugar, and so you'll see that the way I wrote that, it would be stoichiometrically the same thing. And so glucose is C6O6H12. I wrote COH2, and so the ratios are the same there. And so that was just a way of not having to write all that stuff up on there. And I should point out, I mean sugar, that's just one of the, what comes out of the photosynthetic process are sugars, but then these things, the plants are these chemical factories that then turn these compounds into proteins, fats, and starches, a whole range of things.
I got you back on the show.
Thanks.
What kind of studies might be doing on the swan and the flathead at the biological station?
Okay, so your question, what kind of studies might be going on the swan and the flathead? So, at the moment, there's a tremendous amount of work going in the middle for the flathead, and most of that was carried out before I got here. So Jack Stanford and Rick Howard had an extremely long and productive research career out there, and I hope to maintain some of that work. And so we have some proposals in right now to look at how the subsurface, so the groundwater, cycles nitrogen, and how processes, there's a lot of work on carbon up there. We don't know much about how nitrogen's processed in the groundwater. So that's one topic. The other one is the swan is full of wood, and I work with a colleague as a fluvial geomorphologist, and she loves wood and rivers. And so we floated it with Tom this summer and had a great day. We can tell stories about that later.
What's a fluvial geomorphologist?
Oh, a fluvial geomorphologist, simple. Somebody studies the shape of rivers.
Is it floating when you're dragging over logs the whole time?
Pardon? Oh yeah, right. Is it floating when you're dragging over logs? So we drag boats down the river, and so one of the questions is, what does that wood do to the shape of the river, and how does that affect biotic processes in it? And so maybe we get a lot more respiration from storage of organic matter and flow of water through the subsurface in these areas with wood. And so one idea is to look and see how carbon cycles in wood-rich and wood-poor sections of the Swan River. I mean, that's something I'll probably do right away. There's some work on nitrogen I'd like to do in there too.
So the larger wood, the better?
Pardon?
The larger the wood, the better.
Well, what large wood does that will strongly change the shape of the stream, and so it'll form these big dams, and when floods come along, it'll scout big pools, and so anyone who fishes the Swan River would know to be fishing near the wood, because that's where the fish are going to be.
Do they also grow algae?
The wood, not so much. Does wood grow algae? Yeah, no, yeah. It may affect where algae grows, but not a big one.
So a lot of times we throw around terms like healthy lakes or healthy rivers, and to us as humans that means clear water for recreation and big fish. But would you say there's a more objective term that's non-anthropogenic based to determine a healthy river?
Okay, we can spend a lot of time chatting about that. But in general, I'd say a river that is sort of in a reference condition, so not as mucked up by humans. And so you could go to a river in Yellowstone, and that river might be really, really warm, and because of that, it's only got 2 species of insects in it. And so if a river around here had only 2 species of insects, we'd say that's horribly polluted. But in Yellowstone, that's normal because the river's that warm and it's got all these chemicals in it. So it's relative to what would be there had we not messed it up. Now that's very difficult to do because we've messed up most rivers. And so how do we assess what the reference condition is? How do we manage the Klamath River back to some state? And that's where the tough decisions get made.
Do you have any recommendations for fishing?
Do I have any recommendations for fishing around here? No, because I'm only learning to fish a little bit around here. I just got here. Oh gosh, but I mean, I don't think I fish any better than anybody else or any worse because of what I know about rivers. I do know that go to areas with lots of wood and fish near them in the Swan River. And then I'll occasionally take a drift net with me and see what's drifting and use that as a way to, and in productive rivers that works, but in general I use about the same techniques as anybody else. I'm not nearly as good an angler as, say, my undergraduate students are. They take me out fishing and that's always fun to watch.
So let's say you've got some property that's got a really beautiful stream flowing through it, and it's forested. It's a woodland. There's birch trees and spruce trees growing on either side. And pretty frequently, a birch tree topples over and lands in the stream. Yeah, well, it's not very aesthetic, but a lot of people think you should just leave it there. And it sounds to me like you're thinking probably you should just leave it there.
Well,
my colleague,
you have to say, let's say this is the answer. Let's say there's a birch tree that falls into a stream. He's talking about his stream.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So my colleague Ellen is a fluvial geomorphologist, wrote has a talk that she gives where the title of the talk is, and this gets at the healthy rivers. Messy rivers are healthy rivers. And so a lot of wood is the way these rivers used to look. And in some places beavers, lots of beavers in rivers, and they used to, so the goal is to maintain the functions and the structure of the river before people came along. And yeah, I'd leave that wood in the stream. Boaters don't like it though.
All right, one last question for the evening. There we go.
So now that you are new here and everything, what is the thing you were most excited about working on?
Research-wise, I assume. Okay, because I had a lot of other things to do, teaching and what is the most exciting thing? There's two things. So one is this question of what's the wood doing in the Swan River. I think I've just never seen a river with that much wood in it. And if you're gonna go study wood in a river, go to a place like that. Most of the time, most of the wood research is done in these dinky streams, and this will be fun to go to a big river. I'm also interested in going up and seeing what happens. This is a proposal that we're writing with a group of folks at the biostation. Jim is leading it. Is to look at what's climate change going to do to rivers up at the streams at a very high elevation, these alpine streams. And one of the things I'd like to do is ask, the insects live in these streams, and one thing is that the timing of when the food comes and when the water flows are going to change each year. Will their timing of their life history change with it? Will they be stuck emerging in July when all the food shows up in June, for example? That's an interesting question I'd like to do here. It's easier to do here because we have access to this lovely alpine environment.
Take one more. Jim likes to get the last one.
So thank you, Bob. That was a really nice talk. So I could ask you about autochthonous and allochthonous production, C4, C13, stabilized fractionation, photorespiration we were talking about, genomics, but my final question, wrap it all up, is what's your favorite river?
Good question. Before we do that, so we do have some good words. The word allochthonous and autochthonous. Autochthonous means from within, and that won the spelling bee in 2004. That's how obscure that was. The Scripps spelling bee. What's my favorite river? The Snake River in Yellowstone National Park. And the reason why is because it is as wild a river as you're going to see in the lower 48. Okay, the south fork of the Flathead probably is too, but I haven't been there yet. It's full of grizzly bears and wolves. Wolves came up to me while I was fishing in there, and the fishing is ridiculous, and you'll never see another human being fishing. And it's a cool place.
Amazingly done, Bob. I'm impressed with the both. Again, Science on Tap. Every time we do it, I'm amazed by the lack of membership. No. Amazed by the questions. It's uncanny, the ability of our audience here to come up with really amazing questions. I really wish I had yelled out, "What's your favorite river?" because I knew it was going to be. I knew Jim had that question. I think I'm really pleased with the turnout on Science on Tap. There was one question that was not asked that I hoped you could answer. If you'll indulge me, a host level question here. Could you take 30 seconds and talk about allochthony versus autochthony? Quick side note. The winning word actually was in my dissertation. I made a point to that. Autochthony was the winning word in the script spelling bee. Autochthonous, right? This guy. My question to you is can you talk about autochthony versus allochthony in lakes for 30 seconds?
Lakes. Okay, so that's a question about lakes. That's a bit of a softball. So in streams, we know that most of, it's been known for years that a lot of the carbon that feeds the food web comes from outside the stream. We've known this for decades, and it's become sort of the way we think. We're like, well, of course a mayfly, a fish is made from leaves. I mean, how else is it going to be like dumb? And then we discovered that algae can fuel the food web, and we were all just amazed at that, like, who knew? And so in lakes, it's the exact opposite. So in lakes, the paradigm was that it was always algae, and then carbon that comes in from outside the lake, leaves falling in, dissolved organic matter, that's like tea, coming into the lake, can also fuel the food web, but that's a tremendous amount of controversy in lakes right now, scientific controversy. The stream ecologists all shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know what the deal is, and of course that's what's going on in smaller lakes, but certain lake ecologists are finding this to be controversial. But the interesting thing is they're doing some fantastic research to answer the question. And so the stream ecologists, because we always knew it was the case, we don't bother to measure it very much. We're just like, well, of course that's the way, so let's just not even waste our time developing fancy new techniques to do it. The lake ecologists have made fancy new techniques based on fatty acids, stable isotopes of hydrogen, very expensive labeling experiments with to be able to do this work, and the research is just terrifically interesting, even if all the stream ecologists think they know the answer.
32 seconds. All right, as a matter of housekeeping, if you are a Science on Tap guest tonight and you have a tab running with Renee, which she's gone, this is the second time tonight the waitress has not been on point. Usually she's right there. If you have a tab in the evening, I'd like you to close it up with her because she's worked really hard and done a great job managing a pretty unruly crowd. I mean, you guys. If you have a tab with her, please take it up with her versus going up to the front of the desk here, or front of the house. Once again, thanks, Bob. I want to make a Science on Tap announcement. We had a presentation from Diana Boyd, who is a wolf expert, especially, a Western U.S. wolf expert, but she's been bumped back to December. So we will make an announcement online in regards to the November host. We have feelers and hopeful invitations out there. We will be in touch about what's coming in November. I'd encourage everybody to come regardless of the talk title, of course. And I made my announcement about the waitress. I'll reiterate, please talk to her about your tabs. And lastly, there she is. Hi, Renee. How about a round of applause for Renee? I think the bottom line is bring her your money is what you need to do. Yeah, her money, I guess.